Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, the Perils of Procedural Inertia, with Craig Schrotter, CPIM. My name is Christopher Jablonski, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extra starting early next week. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Craig Schrotter, CPIM. Craig spent 6 years in the U.S. Air Force and civilian air traffic control before beginning his career in manufacturing in 1978. 20 years later, he made the transition to manufacturing software with Profit Key International. As a manufacturing consultant and applications engineer, he guides implementations and designs software features, including an innovative Kanban module. And Craig, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you all, and I appreciate your attention. Today, we're going to look at the difference between procedural inertia and the resistance to change we see all the time, and why procedural inertia is so much more dangerous. Procedural inertia is hard to see. It's nearly invisible. There we go. I'm sorry, a little trouble with the mechanism there. Procedural inertia is hard to see. It's nearly invisible from within an organization. But we're going to look at some ways you might find it. And finally, we're going to see how to get out from under procedural inertia once you do find it. Unfortunately, it's not easy. While procedural inertia can exist in nearly all organizations, its effects are most clear when examined in an environment that is ostensibly controlled using an ERP system. The case study here, just as those presented in the article entitled "A Breakaway from the Routine" in the July-August 2013 issue of APICS magazine, are taken from the author's personal experience as a manufacturing consultant and applications engineer with Profit Key International, a well-known ERP provider. On seeing or hearing the term procedural inertia, most people think it refers to the tendency to resist change. Most of us have seen this resistance, and we've certainly all felt it. The saying, "He'd rather curse the darkness than light a candle," makes reference to that very aspect of human nature that fights any kind of change. But procedural inertia isn't just hanging on to what's comfortable. I know we've all wanted to throttle the next person who says, "But that's the way we've always done it." And those of us who've been in the military have probably heard, "There's no reason for it, it's just policy." But as irritating as these can be, they're not procedural inertia. Okay, then what is procedural inertia? Procedural inertia is the tendency of organizations, upon perceiving a deficiency or flaw and failing to correct the root cause, to address the problem by implementing a new procedure, and then to address problems created by the new procedure by implementing a second, then a third, and so on, until a complex network of layered procedures exists. Dependency on this procedural network eventually becomes so great that the organization finds it difficult or impossible to change. This happens when the organization starts using data provided by its network of procedures. Sales produces forecasts. Production and scheduling make decisions. Capital expenditures are decided upon. Personnel issues are addressed. Eventually, the organization develops a strong dependency on the data pulled through its procedures and the control effected through them. Finally, the organization becomes so deeply tied to its procedural network that even when it becomes aware of the optimal methodology, it finds itself unable to change. At this point, the procedures have become the conduit for the organization's information rather than its ERP system. And where an ERP system is virtually unlimited in its informational capacity, the procedure network has an inherent saturation point. After all, a human can read and assimilate the data from only so many forms and reports in a given time. They can fill out only so many documents and send only so many emails. While a manufacturing organization's growth is normally constrained by the availability of materials and capacity, it is now constrained instead by the procedure network's capacity to carry information. The personnel performing the procedures manage to keep up with the load for a time. They redouble their efforts, work additional time, and hire more personnel to the extent possible. Because those working the procedures are most often administrative or staff, rather than line personnel, evidence of their extra effort rarely reaches upper management. From the top, as long as the required information and control continues to flow, the building crisis is nearly invisible. This continues until the system reaches its breaking point and simply collapses. Now, the situation that was undetected yesterday becomes one of the organization's greatest problems today. In some cases, the organization becomes aware that something is wrong before the ultimate collapse and reaches out for help. In this case, to its ERP vendor. Upon examination of the organization's procedures, the ERP vendor recognizes the fundamental error that gave rise to the procedural network and makes recommendations on the best practices to be implemented instead. But the organization feels itself so dependent on its procedures, all of its decision-making and control processes are based on the information they provide. Indeed, its very business model may be based upon this information, that the organization resolves to press on with its current methods. As mentioned before, an ERP system has a virtually unlimited capacity for information. As long as the organization has access to materials and capacity, it can continue to grow, and the ERP system will continue to support it. But once the company's conduit of information switches from its ERP system to its procedures, a bottleneck forms and the company's growth stops. The information constraint imposed on the organization by its own procedures acts as an artificial cap on the company's growth. That is procedural inertia. The insidious thing about procedural inertia is that generally it's only obvious from outside the organization. So how can you tell if you're experiencing its beginnings? Fundamentally, you're looking for a drop in administrative efficiency. Remember, if procedural inertia is happening and your procedures are becoming saturated, people are likely working harder to deal with the overload. So look for changes in the demeanor and effectiveness of personnel. Have people lost their senses of humor? Do they seem generally harried? Are sick and personal days on the rise? Is there an increase in personnel conflicts? Are reports late or not delivered at all? When reports are delivered, has their quality dropped? Are there stacks of paper where none were before? Has there been an inordinate increase in requests for additional administrative personnel? Has there been an increase in personnel leaving the organization? Certainly, this list is not exhaustive, but it gives a sense of the type of indicator to look for. Often, the drop in administrative efficiency affects production, scheduling, and materials as well. The delay in information speed can reduce these departments' effectiveness, translating into fewer on-time deliveries and an increase in material cost. And while indicators are taken individually do not necessarily indicate procedural inertia, when they start appearing in groups, you may have a problem. And keep in mind, even in groups, these indicators are usually cyclical. They seem to resolve for a while before returning. This is due to personnel regaining control for a while, then relaxing, only to have control slip away. And the dwells between these cycles tend to become shorter over time. The fact is, you may be using the wrong ERP system. While most tend to be similar in their fundamentals, they can differ significantly in their peripheral features. Some, for example, are very good at managing flow processes, while others are stronger in a batch environment. Some offer very strong purchasing features, which might be a plus for a firm with deep and wide bills of materials. Others are very good at scheduling, which may be better suited for capacity-intensive organizations. And of course, there are some systems that are highly flexible and can benefit a wide range of organizations. Ultimately, you need to be sure you're not trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. One way to approach this issue is to conduct research as if you were shopping for a new system. After all, you might be. You may even want to schedule some demos with other systems. But keep in mind, if you've got the right ERP vendor, they can be your greatest asset. There will likely be a charge, but having an applications engineer, or AE, review your workflow can be invaluable. This will certainly show you if and when you've made your fundamental error. It will also show you how to properly exploit your ERP system to receive its full benefit. As we said earlier, not every ERP system is perfectly suited for every environment. Yours may have been right 10 years ago, but changes in your market, your product mix, or your business model may have rendered it less effective. In either case, having certain customizations done may be far more efficient than starting over with a whole new system, which will likely have its own limitations. A good ERP vendor will be willing to work with you in this regard and may even roll your customization into the standard product so you're not stuck paying periodic maintenance fees. If your top management isn't behind this, stop. There's really no need or point in going forward. For a project like this to work, you must not only overcome your crushing network of procedures and the company's dependence on them, but you must also overcome an entire culture. To achieve these goals, everyone must be convinced that top management is entirely behind the project and is prepared to take any necessary steps to ensure its success. This means accountability. And while that may sound obvious, it's surprising how many organizations fail to hold their people accountable. This is going to be a lot of work, and some weighty issues are going to arise. As a result, a lot of decisions are going to need to be made, and some of them are going to be difficult. Once the tough decisions are made, they may necessitate that some equally difficult steps be taken. The importance of planning cannot be overemphasized. Once you've determined you've got the right ERP system, management has given it support, and you're ready to make decisions and take steps, a whole new workflow may need to be developed. This will likely require the assistance of your applications engineer and certainly representatives from your company's various disciplines. Test each new step against realistic data. Validate results. Look for unintended consequences. Then, once the new processes are validated, be sure your personnel are adequately trained. Remember, they're going to tend to lapse back into their old habits when under stress. The right training will help them stay on track. Now, a case study. The subject organization is a manufacturing firm that produces large, complex molds for the production of precision pump and jet engine components. These molds are universally large, typically weighing in excess of 2,000 pounds, and when stood on end, being 5 to 7 feet high. The cavities of the two mold halves contain dozens of smaller components, or inserts, which produce the topography of the molded product. Each of these inserts must be manufactured as a distinct item. In addition to the mold body and the cavity it contains, the mold includes various mechanisms, such as slides and ejectors, that allow the mold to be opened and closed while in the press and force the product from the mold when the molding process is completed. Again, each of these components must be manufactured as a distinct item. Finally, the mold contains various fittings, hoses, and electrical components to regulate the mold's temperature during the molding process. The firm employs about 200 personnel, with about 50 in the areas of administration, planning, engineering, and materials. The production personnel work 2 shifts, with a 3rd shift when needed. The molds are typically priced between $400,000 and $700,000, with an occasional unit significantly greater. In most cases, a series of progress payments are required, whereby the customer is invoiced for a percentage of the mold's price upon physical completion of manufacture, and the balance on customer approval. Steel of various grades is the primary raw material. It is typically purchased in blocks, each sized to facilitate the manufacture of a specific insert or portion of the mold body or other component. These components are treated as subassemblies of the parent mold. Each sized block is treated as a discrete item. Other purchased items range through various fittings, hoses, specialized hardware, and electrical components. Virtually all items are purchased to a specific job as opposed to being purchased for inventory. Plus, every steel subassembly related to the cavity must be heat treated, which is handled as a purchased external process. Each subassembly is configured in the ERP system to be treated as a subordinate leg on the single multi-level job producing the mold, rather than as a classical make-to-stock item. The ERP system is capable of scheduling the entire product structure as a single entity using one of several finite methods. The nature of the product structure results in routings that often contend with each other for the same capacity. The order quantity is nearly always one, with molds scheduled for multiple deliveries being produced on staggered individual jobs. It is not uncommon to see individual operations with run rates of 500 to 700 hours per piece. In an effort to optimize setup and minimize outside service costs, the firm adopted the practice of producing the subassemblies for multiple molds at the same time, even though the individual molds' deliveries were staggered over several months. The technique used to accomplish this was to edit the details on the affected jobs, removing subassemblies from all but the earliest due date, and there increasing the subassemblies' quantities to the total required for all of the related jobs. For example, if 3 molds were ordered, all of the subassemblies would be removed from jobs 2 and 3 and loaded into job 1. The ERP system has a feature that allows for the grouping of operations specifically to accommodate this type of situation. In addition, a feature is provided that calculates the proportionate costs of operations performed by the same operator at the same time. Together, these features would have allowed the scheduling personnel to leave each job intact and still accomplish their optimization. Unfortunately, scheduling personnel were unaware of these features. And it was from this activity, this deviation from the ERP system's expected practice, that nearly all other problems derived. Ironically, purchasing found the incorrect practice useful. It enabled them to use the ERP system's buy to job feature to purchase all the steel and components for all the related jobs against a single job. Even here, however, procedures required engineering to produce a printed bill of materials for presentation to purchasing, rather than allowing purchasing to operate directly on requirements generated by the job within the ERP system. Because Job 1, which had all the subassemblies, contained the vast majority of the costs for all three jobs, both material and labor, accounting could not use the costing data provided by the ERP system to determine which job's work in process cost applied to each job. For that matter, no inferences could be made regarding any one job's costs. Only the aggregate costs for the set of three jobs could be seen as being remotely valid. To manage this situation, the firm's IT department developed an application in Microsoft Access in which a vehicle called a shop order was created and served as the collection point for all data, costing and otherwise, regarding each customer's PO. All notes, records of conversations, and links to scanned documents resided in the respective shop order. All costing data was entered there as well. Material costs were entered based on a manual examination of each AP invoice. Typically, a set of molds would have as many as 1,800 to 2,000 AP invoices, when those for outside heat treating were included. Labor, while collected through the ERP system, was extracted by a second access application. These data were then presented to accounting in report form and then manually entered under the appropriate shop order. The access application for managing labor was seen as necessary in order to allocate overtime costs to those jobs on which they were incurred. Personnel were unaware that such a feature existed in the ERP system. When month-end closing was performed, accounting had to carry out a calculation on each shop order to determine the extent to which its jobs had been completed. This value was treated as receipts into finished goods. The remainder was then treated as work in process. Using these procedures, it was common for a month-end closing to take nearly 2 weeks. Moreover, because scheduling personnel had grouped the majority of work for the set of jobs into the first job, the finite scheduling system was working with invalid standards and thus returning invalid data. Since the scheduling system could not be used, all scheduling had to be done manually. With a product as complex as these molds, even the most conscientious attempt at scheduling will eventually degrade into launch and expedite. After several years and the normal turnover in personnel, the ERP system came to be regarded as all but useless. No one who remained was aware of many of even the most basic functions. Virtually no aspect of the system was used beyond order entry, purchasing, and AP, and even these were woefully underused. Even functions as basic as shipping and AR invoicing were not processed through the ERP system, leaving accounting to hand type each of the extremely complex invoices. Estimates were made outside the system, so any actual versus estimate analysis had to be made between the data in the shop order and those in the external estimate. Even here, the only valid comparisons were those between the actual costs on the set of molds in the shop order versus the estimate for the entire set. This situation persisted over 15 years, allowing misconceptions about perceived limits on the ERP system to become deeply ingrained in the firm's culture. During this time, an entire suite of reports was developed to be accessed through the firm's intranet, many of which virtually duplicated those provided by the ERP system. In late 2006, the company was forced to upgrade to the newest version of the ERP system because the version they were using had become so old it was no longer supported. The ERP vendor was contacted and an applications engineer was dispatched to train the company's personnel on the new version. While engaged in the training, the applications engineer recognized the serious errors in the company's use of the ERP system and brought them to the firm's attention and explained the proper methodology. The company noted the application engineer's advice, but chose to continue in the present vein, redesigning their existing shop order system and associated reports and procedures to operate as before, but in the new ERP version. Then, in 2010, the firm's ownership changed. Coincidentally, new accounting rule changes regarding the recognition of revenue were imposed. The new rules now actually mandated the methodology that the firm had been using casually, namely treating the completed portion of a job as finished goods. The new rules, however, called for this value to be recognized as revenue. So now, these numbers not only had to be defended to upper management, but also had to stand up to independent audits. The new management was also insistent that month-end closings be reduced from 2 weeks to 3 days. In March of 2012, the firm contacted its ERP vendor for guidance. General recommendations were made, one of which involved the creation of a re-implementation team. Another recommendation was that the firm contract for a workflow review. This is an in-depth analysis made by one of the ERP vendor's applications engineers. The deliverable from this analysis was to be a written report detailing the AE's observations and his recommendations as to how the firm should proceed toward fully exploiting the ERP system and to ultimately derive valid costing and scheduling data. The report was delivered in May of 2012. Following the report's presentation, a series of meetings was held between the applications engineer and the implementation team to digest the report's recommendation and develop a strategy for going forward. It is important to note that the firm's new management and the implementation team made a commitment to hold no current practices as sacred and to be amenable to any recommended changes. Among dozens of other recommendations, the report made it clear that the practice of manipulating job details in an effort to optimize efficiency was foundational to the firm's current state. It was also pointed out that features exist in the system which make this practice unnecessary. Many other features were cited that could be used in lieu of external procedures. For example, the ERP system is capable of allocating overtime costs to specific jobs if the attendance and labor data collection systems are properly used. Also, a document management system is available to provide links to scanned documents and other files. Another issue was the reporting of quantity complete when reporting labor. With a runtime of 700 hours and an order quantity of 1, the question was, what value should the operator report for quantity complete so that the corresponding load could be removed from the schedule? A feature was cited that makes this calculation and reports the proper percentage quantity automatically. One difficult issue was that there was often a disagreement between line item information on the customer's PO and the part numbers of the products being produced. This mismatch was the primary reason why shipments had not been processed through the ERP system. A methodology was offered that would allow 2 versions of the customer's PO to be entered, one for sales, which would duplicate the customer's PO, and one for production, which would list the items to be produced. These produced items would then be converted into part numbers matching the line items on the original PO, which would allow shipment from inventory. This, in turn, would allow invoicing through the ERP system. Following the implementation team's acceptance of the report, key personnel received in-depth training on the entire ERP system. Non-key personnel received training in their specific disciplines. Then a series of workshops were scheduled where, by department, personnel would meet with the team and the AE to develop procedures. The first step here was to quantify the current procedures and then map out new methods that would support the underlying concept of deriving valid costs from the ERP system. Each meeting lasted about 3 days, during which the new procedures were written and tentatively approved. During the next 3 weeks, the new procedures were tested in a test database for problems and failures to integrate. It was often found that additional information, not originally recognized as important, had to be recorded. This was especially true in order entry. These issues were addressed upon the AE's return before beginning the next workshop. Issues of recording unanticipated information were often addressed through the use of user-defined fields. Training was conducted with administrative personnel in the areas of security and database schema. The latter was necessary to allow new reports to be written that would extract data directly from the ERP system for use in analysis and management. Purchasing was a major stumbling block because under the new system, one mole to one job, their workload was about to be multiplied several times. The new procedures called for material to be purchased to the specific job for which it was intended, rather than all to the first job in a set. This, of course, would yield valid material costs, but it called for purchasing to purchase the same items on multiple purchase orders, each related to a specific job. The applications engineer designed a new product feature for the ERP system, which would allow purchasing to specify a customer's PO, and the system would then return all requirements for all the jobs associated with that customer's PO. Purchasing would then automatically generate purchase orders with line items and delivery schedules that support all the jobs in a customer's PO at once. The company paid a fee for the development of this new feature, but in return, it was rolled into the standard product so no periodic maintenance would be required. Several other customizations were made to facilitate the needs of the firm, all of which were incorporated into the standard ERP system. The customizations were delivered in December of 2012. The month of January 2013 was spent testing the entire set of new procedures and customizations. Particular attention was paid to the validation of costing data. Then, in February 2013, the firm went live with the new system. Today, valid costing data is already being captured for jobs entered under the new procedures. Another year will be required for orders entered under the old process to flush out, at which time the firm will be able to use the costing information directly from the ERP system for all jobs. It is expected that with valid standards in place, finite scheduling will come fully online then as well. Thank you.
And thanks, Craig. And now, of course, we've saved some time for Q&A. So as a reminder, please type your question in the questions box if you wish at the right of your screen and click send. And let's take a few moments to look at the questions that are coming in. All right, Craig, our first question is, do you think that companies look at procedural approaches as a means of not needing to have the right qualified and educated personnel?
I've seen people try to teach procedures to personnel by rote. Normally, I find that the best way to teach someone how to carry out a task is to try to get them to understand why they're doing what they're doing, rather than just teaching them what buttons to press. When they actually understand why they're doing various things, and they understand how what they do is interacting with stations up and downstream from them. When something off the wall happens, they don't just stand there staring at the screen. They can often adapt to it, or at least know enough to stop what they're doing and ask a question. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
I hope so too. I think so. Let's go right on to our next question. Do you have any pointers about perhaps what elements to look for when making a switch from one ERP system to another?
Well, like I talked about a little bit in the presentation, you need to try and find out if you're, say, for example, a capacity-intensive company. Are you a company where you're a job shop, where what you make is you typically make short or small quantity runs with long lead times, and most of the value in your product is in labor, and your materials are typically not all that expensive, and you tend to make strictly to order, and you don't purchase anything until you actually have an order for it? Or are you more on the end toward repetitive manufacturing, where you make things probably to forecast and put them in stock in anticipation of an order, or maybe you're making to a master schedule? I have found that at least in the market segment that Profit Key addresses, our customers tend to fall not in the center. They tend to lean toward the job shop end of it, but they almost universally are hybrids, where there's a certain amount of job shop activity, and there was a certain amount of repetitive manufacturing. In a different position, when I was in manufacturing, I worked in an environment that made scientific instruments. They were very complicated, and our market niche was the custom market for gas chromatography. And the lore that we had was that everything was custom. But once I looked really at the bill of materials, I realized that once I got below the second or third level, about 80% of everything in there was common. So I was able to master schedule a lot of things up to a certain level and then customize them as I need them. So to answer your question without going all the way around, you need to figure out where you lie in that spectrum and find an ERP system that accommodates your model best. Usually you'll find one that a really good one will be able to handle just about anything, but there are those that are specifically geared toward one end of the spectrum or the other.
All right, great, thank you. Our next question is, in this case study that you illustrated, or in any other case studies you're aware of, do you have any idea of how many of the people involved were APICS certified?
At this particular instance, I don't believe anybody was. Although there were a number of people there who certainly could have been had they taken the tests. In my experience as an applications engineer and manufacturing consultant, I do have occasion to work with quite a few APICS certified people, and it usually makes my job a little easier. But to answer your question, no, I don't think any of the people there were. I suspect that had they been, the situation would not have been as bad as it was.
Exactly. That's certainly what I like to hear. Our next question is, what were the specific measurements that you used to deem the change a success, or what were the metrics?
Well, it's a qualified success right now because they've only recently gone live. But the big measure of success was that once the new procedures were developed and they were tested against, it was test data, but it was a duplicate of live data. And it was tested over a period of a couple of months. They went in knowing what kind of results they expected to get, what costs they expected to find for materials, what costs for labor, what costs for burden, and they were getting exactly those values. So the accounting people on that end of it, who when we began the project were doing everything manually, we're now looking at a situation where they could run a couple of reports and have their end of month ready to be put together. They were just overwhelmed. So that was that's the measure of success I'm using at this point now. They still haven't finished getting scheduling online because all the old data hasn't flushed out, and there's so much inaccurate data in the schedule that the schedule can't make any valid inferences from it. But once that begins to resolve itself, I have full expectation that they're going to be able to do finite scheduling very nicely.
Great. Our next question is, are you aware of any other case studies, or do you have any information available about situations that don't involve changes to the ERP system?
Oh, certainly. I've been to other situations where I've seen this same kind of phenomenon, and no change to the ERP system was necessary. In fact, in this particular case, the case study I presented, the ERP system wasn't changed. It was simply implemented correctly. So I want to make that clear. I just wanted to point out in the presentation that one problem you might find is that you have the wrong ERP system. That was not the case in the case study I presented. And in fact, I have never been to an implementation where the ERP system was completely scrapped. It virtually always turned out to be user-induced, as it were, where again somebody has a fundamental error in that. Like, for example, in the article, I don't know how many of you have read it, but in the article, the one thing that people didn't understand was that there was a mechanism in their ERP system to receive completed or finished items from the shop floor into inventory. And because they didn't know that, they were making adjustments into inventory, and that set into process an entire cascade that brought them to near virtual collapse. So changing the ERP system is very often not the answer. I have been in places where the ERP system had been changed prior to my arrival, and sometimes I wonder, I was always gratified to go someplace where someone has chosen Profit Key over another system, but sometimes I wondered whether it was really the older system's fault, or whether they had just so badly implemented it that they'd thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and we were the beneficiary of that decision.
All right, thank you. For our next question, I'm going to kind of take one that's a bit longer, and it's almost a case study in itself. So if there's any part of this that doesn't make sense, just let me know and I'll repeat it. So this person says, I've asked my manager to champion change. We're working with an ERP system that has been in place for several years, and with many changes to overcome decisions that were made years ago. I'm told that the module I use was never upgraded after the AE came to train. He said it has been revised 15 times. We also never implemented the production modules, the factory sales schedule using Excel. They all use their own. My manager has agreed to talk to corporate, but what do we do if it is found not to be that important?
What do you think the questioner asks when they say, what do you think they're talking about when they say if they find what is found not to be that important?
I think the idea is that the question asker is saying, what do we do if our management does not find that these issues involving our ERP system are that important, are important enough to invest in?
Well, I kind of covered that. I said if management isn't behind your project, you're pretty much stuck. And I actually lived in an environment like that for a while, and I finally had to leave because it was I was completely hamstrung. And I have been an applications engineer and been put in situations where on the one hand management has insisted that the system be made to work properly, but they wouldn't invest in upgrades or the new features that would allow the problems to be addressed using best practices. And so basically we just had to punt and do the very best we could. What I would suggest if you can is try to find either someone at the ERP vendor's company that can go to bat for you, or if you can find other companies that are using the same system or a similar system and are making a success of it, if you can get one of them or several of them to speak to your management, maybe they can impress upon them the importance. But if they won't back your project, you're really put in a position of telling them, look, if you're going to give me the responsibility of attaining certain goals, you're going to have to give me the authority to do what's necessary to accomplish it. And if not, I can't guarantee I'm going to be able to solve your problem for you. I know it's easy to sit here and say that, but I don't see another option other than get help from outside.
Yeah, I think that's about what you can say about that sort of situation, and it's tough to sort of address exactly what's going on at any one particular company without sort of getting super involved in it. I think we have time for maybe just one more or possibly two short questions. So if we're not able to get to your question today, you have Craig's information is on your screen, and I'm sure he'll be happy to get back to you on that. Our next question is, in the situation you illustrated, who initially was responsible for making the decisions for the ERP system, and did they understand much about it?
I don't know. They were gone long before I got there.
Well, I suppose that answers that question. And let's look what's interesting here. So as a business analyst, how are you able to convince users that they are suffering from procedural inertia, and considering the fact that you're an outsider from their company?
Well, it's interesting. I had the opportunity to come back to a company that I had worked for in manufacturing and materials as a consultant, and I gave them the same advice that I had been giving them for several years as an employee, and that they had never listened to. And when they were paying, I think it was $1,300 a day at the time, all of a sudden it made sense to them. But when I see this, I actually get a lot of response from people when I see this kind of problem, and I point it out to them, because it's a shame, but because it's coming from outside their organization, they assign a greater value to it. It's always been that way. It's wrong, but that's exactly how it is. And very often I will have people, not lower level, but middle management people speaking to me, telling me that they know there's a problem and they can't get their management to recognize it. Would I speak to them? And when I do, all of a sudden it becomes a major project. So it may be as simple as either contacting, if you have an ERP vendor, contacting them, or contacting someone like myself to look at your situation and present it to your management. And coming from an outside observation, they may assign it the weight that it's due.
All right, and with that, I believe that's about all the time we have for questions today. Craig, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome. And to all our attendees, thank you for participating in today's APICS Extra Live webinar. This concludes today's edition of APICS Extra Live. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.